this missile and certainly the eloquence behind it is very much focused on China. The Americans are speaking directly to Beijing because apart from what America is doing to end the war in Ukraine, President Trump has been very demonstrative that he sees the main threat coming from China, and that is the main focus for the American military to deter China from trying to expand. The most likely expansion is China taking the island of Taiwan. And the Chinese have been very vocal about that they would like to do that. And encouraged probably by Putin invading Ukraine and the West being very slow to react. So I think at the moment that the US is quite focused on Ukraine, but very much is looking towards trying to stabilize the Far East, which is the region we're talking about. It's no accident the US fleet is in the Far East, so is the British fleet, for instance, again, all acting as deterrence. I think where these weapons come in, we have seen how effective long-range precision-guided missiles have been. And the PRISM, as it's colloquially known, is really the latest technology that is coming onto the scene. People will be well aware of the HIMARS missile that proved so effective or is proving so effective in Ukraine, particularly against naval ships. The sort of upgrade of the HIMARS is something called ATACMS, slightly longer range. And now the PRISM is the latest missile technology the Americans are demonstrating. It flies incredibly fast, 4,000 kilometers an hour, can attack targets up to about 300 miles away, 500 kilometers away. So the importance, when you look at what we would call the Taiwan theater of operations, it is the ideal weapon to deter the Chinese fleet. Because if China is going to try and take Taiwan, it's going to need to put a lot of ships into that channel between China and Taiwan. And the Americans are sort of saying, and so we know that psychology is so important in warfare, the Americans are saying, well, we now have the technology to take out those ships well before they get to Taiwan. I think the final piece that I'd say is that the Americans have demonstrated the superiority of their missile technology in the attack on the Iranian nuclear power plants last month by their jets and missiles. And that was defended by Russian air defense assets, which didn't work. The American kit was impervious to it. And the Chinese air defense assets and capability is sort of based on Russian technology and developments thereof. So I think it's the Americans very much saying, look, we can stop you in your tracks. So that's, whether it's a game changer or not, but it certainly seems to be exactly the right sort of military capability that should deter the Chinese from any thoughts they have of taking Taiwan, I believe. I mean, the Chinese Navy is huge, and no doubt, and quite modern. They're building a lot of ships, and they will have air defense capabilities. So, but I expect these ships. And one thing with military procurement, when you're building a new ship, because it takes so long, quite often by the time you built it, somebody else has developed a technology that is something you haven't thought of. And that's something the Americans are particularly good at. And this particular PRISM missile, Lockheed Martin, they have produced some amazing bits of kit. And it's generally accepted that American technology is just that much more ahead of Chinese and Russian. Therefore, if you have got a whole array of ships and, to invade an island the size of Taiwan, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of cattle ships, big ships, aircraft carriers that would be needed to get sufficient troops across. And with 300-mile range, they are well within range, sat in their ports sort of thing. So, I think it's very much the sort of first sort of throw of the dice, play of the cards, if you like, by the Americans to Beijing going, we now have a capability that we don't think you can defend against. And, we are developing it, and it will be in Taiwan, and they'll have the capability to use it. And also, very significantly, I think they've mentioned as well that the Australians are also in on this program. And Australia is key for deterrence in the South Pacific, in the Far East as well. So it's not just the Taiwanese who have it and the Americans, but also the Australians. So I think it's a very strong message to the Chinese that actually, if they are unlikely to be successful, it's not like the Ukraine situation where Russia just piled across the border. Actually, China's got a big lump of sea to get across, and as Hitler found in the Second World War, the English Channel was the greatest defence that we had, and actually, in a way, we still have. Again, with Taiwan, trying to take an island, throughout history has never been easy. And if you've come up with some innovative weapon like the prism, then again, I think this will affect Chinese decision making. And the fact the Americans have been so open about it and pushing it so hard, psychologically, it's sort of 1-0 to the Americans and the Taiwanese against the Chinese because of this new capability. Deterrence didn't work for Ukraine, and hopefully Western countries have learned that actually the way to deter people is to show strength. Any weakness is exploited. And President Xi is not unlike Putin in some of his thoughts. It's also believed that maybe President Xi's position is not as strong as it used to be. And this might be another way for the Americans to turn up the pressure on Beijing to say, well, if Xi is using Taiwan to try and strengthen his position, a bit like Putin was saying to the Kremlin and to the Russian parliament, well, I'll get Ukraine back for you to really strengthen my position. Well, if you look, to the Far East, if Xi's trying to do that and the Americans are going, well, no, hang on, that's not going to work because we now have the capability that's going to be in place, and we, the Americans, the West, didn't have a capability that when Putin looked west deterred him. So I think it's about deterrence, and it's about trying to change the thought of the Chinese leadership in Beijing, because they I'm sure would only do this if they were absolutely convinced they'd be successful. The Chinese are they're much more a business nation than the Russians are, and ultimately I think the Chinese see success and domination of the world through finance and through commerce, not necessarily through military action. And if they can be convinced that actually would counter their desires there, one would hope that would be more of a deterrence than anything else.